my son the prince has wronged not just you but also the gods. And the gods have spoken. The prince has lost his manhood to the gods as a punishment for defiling them and for embarrassing all of you. Only you can restore what has been lost. To get his manhood back, he must lay on the ground for each of you to urinate upon his head. I therefore plead with you to help rescue the prince of our kingdom from this shameful predicament. In the heart of a great kingdom, where the sun kissed the golden rooftops of the palace, lived Obinna, a prince whose beauty was the talk of the land. He was not just a man, he was a vision, a masterpiece sculpted by the gods themselves. Women gasped when he passed, and even the bravest warriors envied his striking features. His eyes held the depth of the midnight sky, his skin glowed like polished bronze, and his smile could weaken the knees of even the most composed maiden. But it was not just his looks that made him desirable, he was the heir to the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom, a future king whose touch promised both riches and prestige, from the moment he came of age. Every maiden in the kingdom dreamed of being his bride. They adorned themselves with the finest beads, wrapped their bodies in the most elegant fabrics, and practiced their most graceful walks in hopes of catching his eye. The competition was fierce, for the woman who won his heart would not only become his wife but the future queen of the land. Yet, despite the countless admirers, Prince Obinna remained unmoved. No maiden, no matter how stunning, seemed to meet his impossible standards. His father, King Izuto, the wise and mighty king of Umiura, watched with growing concern. Tradition dictated that the prince must choose a bride from among the maidens of the land, but his son seemed determined to defy that custom. And so, the tension in the palace grew, the kingdom whispering of a prince too proud to wed. One fateful evening, as the golden sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the palace, the king summoned his son. The great hall was filled with the kingdom's most beautiful maidens, each more breathtaking than the last. They stood in a line, their eyes shimmering with hope, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The elders had selected them carefully, ensuring that only the finest, most radiant daughters of the land stood before the prince. Prince Obinna strolled past them, his piercing gaze studying each one with meticulous scrutiny. A maiden with eyes like the moon. Too plain. Another with hair as dark as the night. Not striking enough. Even the fairest of them all, whose beauty had been praised throughout the land, received nothing but a dismissive glance. The murmurs in the great hall turned to silence as the prince stepped back and shook his head. None of them, he declared coldly. Not one is beautiful enough to be my queen. The king's face darkened with disappointment. Son, our village is blessed with the most beautiful maidens in the world. There is no other place you will find one more worthy. And tradition demands that you marry from our land. But the prince was unmoved. I will not let tradition dictate my happiness, he replied. My queen must be the most beautiful woman in existence, and if she is not here, then I must search for her elsewhere. A heavy silence fell upon the court. The king clenched his fists. You dare defy the customs of our ancestors? I will not settle, the prince said firmly. I will not marry until I find her. The elders exchanged worried glances. The maidens, once filled with hope, lowered their gazes in shame. And the king, his heart filled with both anger and dread, knew that his son's reckless decision would bring consequences that no one could yet foresee. The night air was thick with the scent of burning torches as the prince prepared for his journey. Word had spread throughout the kingdom. He was leaving, traveling far and wide in search of a maiden more beautiful than any who had ever walked the earth. The news was met with both awe and outrage. The people could not understand why their prince, blessed with the most stunning women in the land, would turn his back on them. The king met his son in the royal courtyard, his face shadowed with disappointment. Do you truly believe you will find a woman more beautiful than those of your own land? He asked. The prince nodded. I will not return until I do. The king sighed heavily. You do not know what you seek. My son. Beauty alone cannot rule a kingdom. But if you insist on this foolish quest, then go. But mark my words, defying tradition has its price. The prince turned away without a word. He mounted his horse, his guards flanking him on either side. As he rode through the palace gates, the villagers lined the streets, some cheering, others shaking their heads in disapproval. The maidens he had rejected watched in silent anger, their once adoring gazes now filled with resentment. As the prince disappeared into the horizon, the king whispered to himself, "The gods are watching. And they do not take kindly to arrogance." And so, the journey began, a journey that would not only test the prince's obsession but unravel a fate more terrifying than he could ever imagine. The journey was long and treacherous, but Prince Obinna was determined. From the moment he left Umiora, his eyes never stopped searching. He traveled to nearby villages, where the people welcomed him with feasts, eager to present their most beautiful maidens. Some were strikingly fair, their skin glowing like the morning sun, others had eyes as deep as the ocean, voices as soft as a flute's melody. Yet, the prince turned them all away. "She is not beautiful enough," he would say, his tone void of emotion. His guards exchanged glances, growing weary of their master's impossible quest. As the days turned into weeks, they ventured into distant lands where even the prince's name was unknown. There, he found maidens with golden hair, skin dark as the midnight sky, lips as red as pomegranate seeds, but still, none satisfied him. "If she is not the most beautiful woman in the world, then she cannot be my queen," he declared, shaking his head. His arrogance grew, and so did his obsession. He refused to eat at times, spending hours staring at the horizon, convinced that somewhere beyond, a woman of divine beauty awaited him. The villagers began whispering. The prince was cursed with endless desire, blinded by his own vanity. His guards, once filled with excitement, now followed him in silence, their hope fading like the setting sun. But then, everything changed, one evening. As they journeyed back toward Umiora, Prince Obinna's horse suddenly halted. The wind carried the faint sound of splashing water, and as the prince turned, his breath caught in his throat. There, by the riverbank, stood a maiden unlike any he had ever seen. She moved with such grace that even the air around her seemed to bow in reverence. Her dark, lustrous hair cascaded down her back, her skin glowed like polished ebony under the sun, and when she turned to fetch water from the river, the world seemed to slow. Every step she took left an invisible trail of enchantment, and her presence filled the air with an unexplainable, intoxicating fragrance. Prince Obinna's heart pounded. "Who is she?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His guards were speechless. Even they, hardened warriors, found themselves drawn to the maiden's overwhelming beauty. Unable to resist, Obinna dismounted his horse and approached her. She looked up, her eyes locking with his. In that moment, the prince felt something he had never felt before, complete and utter helplessness. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer than it had ever been. She smiled, a smile so delicate yet mysterious that it sent shivers down his spine. "My name is Adanna," she replied, her voice like a lullaby carried by the wind. Prince Obinna did not hesitate. "My name is Prince Obinna, the son and heir to the great king of Umiora Kingdom. Adanna, I have searched far and wide for the most beautiful maiden in the world. Now I have finally found you. You must be my queen." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Adanna's eyes, but she did not protest. Instead, she gave a small nod. "If that is what you desire, my prince, then so be it." Prince Obinna wasted no time. That very day, he sought out Adanna's family, paid her bride price, and declared her his wife. The journey back to Umiora was filled with excitement, at least for the prince. Finally, he thought. Finally, I have found the one worthy of me. But as they rode into the kingdom, something felt different. The air was thick with silence. The villagers lined the streets, staring at Adanna in awe. She was breathtaking, yes, but there was something else, something unnatural about her beauty. Some of the elders whispered among themselves, while the young maidens clenched their fists, their eyes burning with resentment. When they arrived at the palace, King Izuto sat confidently on his throne. His eyes studied Adanna for a long moment before he finally spoke. She is indeed beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than any maiden I have ever seen. But son, you have broken the sacred tradition of our people. The prince frowned. Father, what does it matter? I have found my queen. The king shook his head. You do not understand. The gods protect this land, but they demand loyalty to our customs. You were meant to marry from our people. You have brought an outsider into the throne, and with it, you may have brought something else. The words sent a cold shiver down Obinna's spine, but he quickly brushed it off. Superstition, he scoffed. I am the prince. I do not answer to myths. The king sighed, looking at his son with sorrowful eyes. I will not be responsible for what happens next, he said quietly. That night, as the villagers gathered for a great feast to welcome the new bride, a storm began brewing in the distance. The wind howled, the flames of the torches flickered violently, and the elders of the land whispered a single warning: all that glitters is not gold. But Prince Obinna, lost in his pride, refused to listen. Little did he know, the worst nightmare of his life was only just beginning. The great feast had ended, the music had faded, and the last of the villagers had retired to their homes. The palace was bathed in the soft glow of oil lamps as Prince Obinna led his new bride, Adanna, into his royal chambers. His heart pounded, not with nervousness, but with overwhelming excitement. This was the night he had longed for. The night he would finally be with the most beautiful woman in the world as his queen. Adanna stepped into the chamber gracefully, her every movement enchanting. Her gown shimmered under the dim light, clinging to her perfect form. Obinna felt his breath hitch as she turned to face him, a slow, knowing smile curving her lips. Without a word, she began to remove her jewelry. First, the gold earrings that dangled like tiny suns, then the necklace that gleamed against her dark skin. One by one, she let them fall to the floor. Then, with deliberate slowness, she undid the knots of her royal wrapper and stood completely naked facing Obinna. Obinna's pulse quickened. His eyes devoured every detail: her flawless skin, her graceful posture, the delicate way her hair cascaded over her shoulders. She was beyond human beauty. She was divine, he said to himself. And then, just as he reached for her, it happened. A sharp, searing pain shot through his groin. A cold rush spread through him, and in an instant, his manhood was gone. Obinna gasped, stumbling backward. His hands flew to his groin, but there was nothing. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked up at Adanna, confusion and terror battling in his eyes. But instead of the sweet, submissive bride he had married, he saw something else, something monstrous. Adanna's smile twisted into something cruel. She tilted her head, her eyes glinting with a dark, eerie amusement. Then she spoke. Foolish prince, she whispered, her voice laced with mockery. Did you truly believe beauty comes without a price? And then she laughed, a laugh so chilling, so filled with malice, that the room itself seemed to darken. Obinna fell to his knees, clutching his groin, his mind unable to grasp what had just happened. Obinna's breath came in short, frantic bursts. His eyes darted around the room in disbelief. This cannot be happening. His body trembled as he looked up at Adanna, who now seemed taller, more imposing. Her beauty remained untouched, but there was something unnatural about it now, something ghostly. She stepped closer, bending slightly so her face was mere inches from his. The scent of her skin was still intoxicating, but now, it carried a sinister edge. No man sees my nakedness without a price, she murmured. And you, Prince Obinna, have paid the ultimate price for your arrogance. Obinna's mouth went dry. Who, what are you? He croaked. Adanna smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I am no ordinary maiden, Obinna. I am a messenger of the gods, sent to punish men like you, men who believe they can defy tradition, who think they are above the will of the gods. The prince's heart pounded violently against his chest. No, this is not possible. This must be a dream. Adanna straightened, her eyes gleaming. It is no dream, my prince. You sought perfection, but perfection is an illusion. And now, you have lost the very thing that made you a man. Obinna lunged forward in desperation, his hands outstretched, but before he could touch her, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. The prince was left kneeling on the cold marble floor, his chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The once grand chamber now felt like a tomb, swallowing him in silence. Then, the realization struck him like thunder: he had been cursed. A scream tore through the palace. It was not the cry of a warrior. Not the roar of a prince. It was the wail of a broken man. The guards outside the chamber startled at the sound, exchanging uneasy glances before rushing inside. What they saw sent a shiver down their spines. Prince Obinna, the once proud, untouchable heir to the throne, was curled on the floor, clutching himself, his face contorted in sheer horror. He stumbled to his feet, his breath ragged. He could barely think, barely see. His vision blurred as he ran through the palace halls, ignoring the shocked gasps of the guards, the horrified stares of the palace servants. He burst into his father's chambers, his voice hoarse and wild. "Father!" he screamed, falling to his knees. "My manhood! My manhood is gone!" King Yasuto rose from his throne, his expression unreadable. He studied his son for a long, painful moment. Then, in a voice calm yet heavy with unspoken grief, he simply said, "I warned you." Obinna's world crumbled. His breath hitched, his hands trembled, his stomach twisted in unbearable agony. The great prince of Umiura, the man who had searched the world for the most beautiful woman, had finally found her, but in doing so, he had lost everything. The palace was cloaked in an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of Prince Obinna's ragged breathing. He knelt before his father, his face drenched in sweat, his body trembling from the unspeakable horror he had just experienced. The weight of his shame pressed down on him, suffocating him like a heavy cloak. King Yasuto watched his son, his expression unreadable. The royal guards and elders stood in the shadows, whispering among themselves, their faces etched with both concern and grim satisfaction. The prince who had once looked down on the maidens of their land, who had defied the will of the gods, had been reduced to nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the king finally spoke. "Summon the chief priest." The command sent ripples through the court. Moments later, Okadike, the chief priest, arrived, his ancient staff clutched in his wrinkled hands. His eyes, sharp and knowing, swept over the prince, lingering on the despair carved into his face. Without a word, Okadike took Prince Obinna outside, drew a circle on the floor with white chalk. He told the prince to kneel inside the circle he drew, and he began chanting in a low, haunting voice. The prince watched in dread as the priest slaughtered a white goat, letting its blood spill onto the ground. The air became heavy with the scent of burnt offerings as Okadike threw sacred herbs into the fire. The kingdom waited in breathless suspense. Finally, after long moments of silence, Okadike opened his eyes. His voice was deep, reverberating through the chamber like a tolling bell. "The gods have spoken." All eyes turned to the priest as he delivered the shocking decree. For the prince's manhood to be restored, he must lie on the ground, and every maiden in the kingdom will urinate upon his head. A heavy silence fell upon the court. The words hung in the air, sinking into the minds of all present like a blade twisting into flesh. Obinna's breath caught in his throat. His head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. Surely, he had heard wrong. "What?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. But the priest did not repeat himself. King Yasuto closed his eyes, exhaling heavily. The weight of divine judgment had fallen. The prince shook his head violently. "This cannot be," he cried. "There must be another way. Anything but this." Okadike's expression remained unchanged. "You sought perfection, Prince Obinna, and in doing so, you defied the gods. Now, you will be humbled before those you once rejected." The prince clenched his fists. His body trembled with fury, with shame. But deep down, he knew, he had no choice. The following morning, King Yasuto summoned all the maidens of the kingdom, and soon the announcement spread throughout the village like wildfire. Before nightfall, all the maidens of the kingdom gathered at the palace, their eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: amusement, pity, and scorn. Some had once dreamt of being chosen by the prince, only to be cast aside without a second glance. Now, fate had turned the tables. Standing on the palace steps, King Izuto addressed the maidens. His voice was solemn, his expression grave. "My son, the prince has wronged not just you but also the gods. And the gods have spoken. The prince has lost his manhood to the gods as a punishment for defiling them and for embarrassing all of you. Only you can restore what has been lost. To get his manhood back, he must lay on the ground for each of you to urinate upon his head. I therefore plead with you to help rescue the prince of our kingdom from this shameful predicament." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some maidens hesitated, their faces twisting in disgust at the ritual they were about to perform. Others, however, smirked with wicked delight. In the center of the courtyard, Prince Obinna lay on the ground, his face burning with humiliation. Slowly, one maiden stepped forward and urinated upon his head. Then another. And another. One by one, they carried out the ritual. The night was long. The air was thick with the scent of urine, shame and mockery. Obinna remained on the ground, his body stiff, his face pressed against the dirt, his head soaked with urine. The sounds of laughter and murmurs filled his ears, cutting deeper than any blade ever could. The very maidens he had deemed unworthy now stood over him, reclaiming the dignity he had once stripped from them. When the last maiden stepped forward and urinated upon his head, the ritual was completed. A long silence followed. The prince lay motionless, his pride shattered beyond repair. King Izuto watched from his throne, his expression somber. This was not how he had wished to teach his son humility, but the gods had given their judgment, and he would not interfere. The prince was helped to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. He did not look at the maidens. He did not look at anyone. Exhausted, humiliated, and broken, he stumbled back to his chambers. That night, as he drifted into a restless sleep, something changed within him. The proud prince of Yumiura had finally learned the cruelest lesson of all. Arrogance had a price. The morning sun rose over the kingdom, its golden light filtering through the prince's chamber. Prince Obinna stirred from his troubled sleep, his body drenched in sweat. For a moment, he feared it had all been a dream. The humiliation, the ritual, the curse. But as his mind cleared, a sudden realization sent his hands trembling toward his groin. His manhood had returned. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. Was this real? Had the gods truly forgiven him? He leaped from his bed, his heart pounding against his ribs. His breath came in shallow bursts as he examined himself again, unable to believe what his eyes confirmed. The curse had been lifted. Tears stung his eyes. Tears of relief, of gratitude, and of shame. He stormed out of his chambers, barely pausing to wrap a cloth around himself. Servants gasped as he rushed down the grand hallways, past the guards, and into the throne room. "Father! Father!" he cried. His voice thick with emotion. King Izuto sat on his throne, his face unreadable as he watched his son fall to his knees before him. "It is done. The gods have restored me." Obinna's voice cracked, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The king remained silent for a long moment, then leaned forward. His eyes, once filled with anger, now held something different: wisdom, expectation. "And have you learned your lesson, my son?" The word struck like a thunderclap. This was not just about his manhood. It was about the arrogance, the pride, the disregard for his people. Prince Obinna bowed his head. "Yes, father. I have learned. And now, I must make amends." The palace square was packed. Every maiden, elder, and villager gathered, eager to witness what the prince had to say. The same maidens who had once dreamt of being his bride now stood before him, arms crossed, eyes filled with quiet judgment. They had been insulted, overlooked, cast aside. Now, the prince stood before them, a changed man. "I have wronged you," Obinna began, his voice carrying through the crowd. "I thought beauty was the only thing that mattered. I ignored the wisdom of my father, the warnings of the gods, and the hearts of my people." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some maidens lowered their gazes, while others watched him with skepticism. "You were never unworthy," Obinna continued, his tone raw with sincerity. I was the unworthy one. And I beg your forgiveness." A long silence stretched over the crowd. Then, one maiden stepped forward. "Do you truly mean this, Prince Obinna? Or is this just another game?" The prince dropped to his knees. "Before everyone, I mean every word. I have been humbled, and I will never make the same mistake again," the villagers whispered among themselves. Then, slowly, the maidens nodded. They had won. Justice had been served. But one more thing remained. A choice. Prince Obinna rose to his feet. He had rejected every maiden in his village before, blinded by his own foolish desires. Now, he would choose again, but this time, with wisdom. He turned to the maidens, studying them, not just their beauty but their strength, their kindness, their character. And then, his eyes landed on a young woman standing toward the back. Her name was Nena. She had never tried to impress him before, nor had she wept when he ignored her. She was known for her intelligence, her kindness, and her strength. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward. "Nena," he said, his voice firm. "Will you be my wife?" Gasps filled the air. The maidens looked at one another, shocked. Some had expected him to pick the most physically beautiful among them. But this time, he had chosen differently. Nena hesitated, her eyes searching his face for signs of deceit. But she saw only sincerity. "If the king blesses it, then yes. I will be your wife." The crowd erupted into cheers. King Izuto stood from his throne, watching the scene unfold before him. His son had been humbled. He had been broken and rebuilt. And now, he was finally ready to be a king. He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "You have made a wise choice, my son. A king is not great because of the beauty of his queen, but because of the wisdom in his heart." He turned to Nena, nodding approvingly. "You will make a fine queen." The people erupted in celebration. Drums sounded, voices rose in song, and dancers twirled in joy. The prince, once blinded by vanity, now saw clearly. Far above, unseen by mortal eyes, the gods watched in silence. A balance had been restored. A lesson had been learned, and so, as the kingdom danced beneath the golden sun, Prince Obinna finally became a man worthy of the crown. Thanks for watching this wonderful story. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. See you on the next one.